Have you ever wondered if living close to your children in old age is truly the key to happiness, or could it lead to greater suffering? It's a question many of us might face as we grow older, thinking that being surrounded by family will fill the emptiness we may feel. But what if the very attachment to family, the people we love most, could be the source of our deepest pain? In this video, we'll explore the surprising wisdom of Zen and Buddhist teachings, which might just change the way you think about aging and family relationships. Through the story of an elderly man seeking comfort from his children, you'll discover how attachment to family can lead to isolation, resentment, and disappointment. But there's hope. By understanding the teachings of detachment and impermanence, you'll learn how to find true peace and freedom from emotional dependency. If you've ever felt lonely or unfulfilled in relationships, if you've ever placed your happiness in someone else's hands, or if you simply want to embrace a more peaceful, independent life, then this video is for you. Stick around till the end, and you'll walk away with powerful insights that will help you lead a life of inner peace, no matter your age or situation. Don't miss out on these life-changing lessons. If you are not subscribed, I recommend subscribing and activating the notification bell so you don't miss any videos. Your support means a lot to me, and if you enjoyed this video, you can help me continue spreading the valuable lessons by liking and sharing it. If you like the topic of this video, please comment 1. If you don't, please comment 0 to let me know how I can improve and make better videos for you. Now, let's begin. 1. The desire for closeness. An elderly man, whose once strong and capable hands had shaped the life of his family, now found himself confronting the inevitable passage of time. In his younger years, he had worked tirelessly, building a future for his loved ones, sacrificing his desires to ensure that his children had the opportunities he never did. He had witnessed the laughter of his children filling the house, the chaotic joy of family dinners, and the endless bustle of life. But now, as old age slowly crept up on him, he saw his reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize the tired, silver-haired man staring back at him. The vitality that had once propelled him forward seemed like a distant, almost forgotten dream. His joints had become stiff, and each day was a reminder that the energy he had once possessed was fading. The world around him had changed, and with it, his place in it. His children, who had once looked up to him with wide, trusting eyes, were now grown adults, chasing their ambitions, building their own families, and spreading out across the world. One by one, they moved away, pursuing careers and dreams in far-off places. The house, once filled with the music of life, now stood silent, its walls echoing only the weight of solitude. As he sat in the quiet of his home, a deep, aching emptiness settled over him, a hollowness that seemed to seep into his very soul. The laughter, the bustle, the sense of belonging that had once defined his existence seemed so far away now. He longed for connection, for the warmth that only family could bring. The thought of spending the rest of his days in this solitude gnawed at his heart, filling him with a profound sadness. The realization hit him hard. His children were busy with their own lives, and he was nothing but a distant memory in their busy schedules. One evening, as he stared out of the window, the setting sun casting long shadows across the empty house, a thought began to take root in his mind. Perhaps, he mused softly, it's time to live closer to my children, to be near them, to feel the love of my family once again, to know that in my final years, I won't be forgotten. After all, isn't it their duty to care for me now, as I cared for them when they were young? The idea of closeness, of being enveloped in the warmth of his children's love, seemed to offer the promise of peace, of finally feeling whole again. With a mixture of hope and trepidation, he made the decision. He packed up his life, each item representing a fragment of the life he had lived, and moved to a house not far from one of his children. The first days were filled with optimism, as he was warmly embraced by his family. His grandchildren, full of excitement and curiosity, rushed to greet him with wide, innocent smiles. His children, seeing the frailty in his steps, promised to visit often and keep him close. In those early moments, it felt like a dream, like the pieces of his life were finally falling back into place. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 1 below to let me know that you are still here with me. But as time went on, the cracks in his dream began to show. The reality of living so close to his children wasn't as idyllic as he had hoped. His children, despite their good intentions, were caught up in their own busy lives, and the visits he so desperately longed for became fewer and farther between. The house that had once been so full of love and laughter now felt strangely distant, as though he were simply another fixture in the background of their lives. The loneliness he had sought to escape still lingered, albeit in a different form, an ache in his heart that no proximity could heal. In his quiet moments, he wondered, was this truly what I had hoped for? Was this closeness, this proximity, what I needed all along? The man, once proud and strong, now felt like a shadow of himself, caught between the longing for connection and the painful realization that even the closest of ties can sometimes fail to fill the void. It was a quiet, aching loneliness, the kind that only those who have lived through years of change can truly understand. The desire for closeness, for the return of the love and warmth of family, was a deep, primal need, one that spoke to the very core of his being. Yet, he learned that sometimes what we think we need most is not always what will bring us the peace we seek. As he gazed out at the world beyond his window once more, he couldn't help but feel a deep, lingering sadness. The house, now a quiet space, held within it the echoes of a life lived fully. Yet there remained a longing, an unspoken wish for a closeness that perhaps, in the end, only time and understanding could provide. 2. The illusion of happiness. In the early months, the elderly man felt a deep sense of joy, a comfort that seemed to promise a peaceful end to his years. His children came to visit on weekends, filling his home with laughter and chatter. His grandchildren would run around him, their tiny feet pattering across the floor, their voices ringing with innocence and energy. For a while, it felt as though his long years of hard work and sacrifice had finally paid off. He could almost taste the happiness he had dreamed of in his old age, a life surrounded by family, filled with love, and free from the burdens of the past. But like the fleeting nature of a sunset, this happiness slowly began to fade. At first, the changes were so subtle, so easy to overlook, that he didn't even realize they were happening. His children, once so eager to visit, started coming less and less. Week after week, their visits grew shorter, and the warmth they once brought seemed to dim. He would call them, his voice filled with hope, only to hear the same tired excuses. "I'm busy, Dad," or "I'll come by later, I promise." His heart would sink with each passing day as he felt the distance between them grow. Not physical distance, but an emotional one, a space that seemed to widen with every excuse, every ignored phone call. The grandchildren, who used to fill his days with joy, now seemed preoccupied with their own lives. They had their friends, and their plans, and the old man's presence was no longer the highlight of their day. He would sit by the window, looking out at the world, his heart heavy with longing. The empty chair beside him, once a symbol of love and companionship, now stood as a silent reminder of how alone he had become. He waited for a phone call, waited for a visit, waited for the laughter and warmth that once seemed so effortless. But the waiting was painful, and the silence that followed only deepened his sense of isolation. In those moments of solitude, a profound realization began to settle in. The happiness he thought he would find in the closeness of his family was slowly slipping away. He had spent so many years thinking that living near his children would guarantee him companionship, that their presence would be the balm for his old wounds. But now, it felt like he was a mere observer in their lives, a distant figure watching from the sidelines as they moved forward without him. The reality was harsh. Though he lived in the same house and shared the same town, the emotional distance between them had only grown. One particularly lonely evening, after another quiet dinner with no one to talk to, he sat in meditation, his mind swirling with thoughts of the past, the present, and the future. The quiet of the room was deafening, and as he closed his eyes, he recalled the Buddha's teachings. Attachment is the root of suffering. The words hit him like a thunderclap. Was he too attached to his children? Had he placed all his hopes for happiness on their visits, their attention, their love? Had he expected them to fill the emptiness inside him, only to realize that their lives had moved on, leaving him behind? It was a bitter pill to swallow. The truth that he had clung so tightly to his expectations and desires now felt like a weight on his chest. He had placed his happiness in the hands of others, believing they could fulfill the longing in his heart, but now he saw how misguided that hope had been. The illusion of happiness he had held onto for so long crumbled before him, and he was left to grapple with the uncomfortable reality. True happiness, he now realized, could never come from external sources. It had to come from within. As the night wore on, he found himself reflecting not just on his family, but on his own life, his own choices, and his attachments. He wondered if he had placed too much emphasis on the idea of family as the sole source of happiness. Could there be another way? A way to find peace within himself, even in the absence of others? The answers were not clear, but the question lingered in his mind, quietly challenging everything he had once believed. In his heart, he felt a mix of sadness, acceptance, and a strange sense of clarity. Perhaps this was a lesson he had to learn in his later years, that happiness is not something we can demand from others. It is something we must cultivate within ourselves, regardless of the circumstances around us. And though he still longed for the warmth of his family's presence, he understood now that true contentment would come from within, not from the fleeting moments of joy that had once seemed so certain. 3. The weight of expectations. As the years passed, the man's heart began to carry a growing burden, one that weighed heavier with each passing day. He had devoted his entire life to raising his children, nurturing them with every ounce of love and care, guiding them through their education, and preparing them for a world that could often be harsh and unforgiving. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every moment of doubt. He had given it all for them. Now, in his twilight years, shouldn't they, at least in return, show him the same care and attention? Shouldn't they, out of love and gratitude, offer him some semblance of the comfort he had so selflessly given them? The expectation he had built in his heart was almost palpable, heavy and suffocating. And yet, as the days went on, he found himself more and more disappointed. His children, despite living close by, seemed emotionally distant. They were preoccupied with their own lives and their concerns, and they didn't seem to prioritize him as he had once hoped. This unspoken expectation was like a festering wound in his soul, growing more bitter and painful with time. How could they be so indifferent? Wasn't he worthy of their care after all these years? He often caught himself muttering in frustration, "Why did I leave everything behind and move here, if this is how my old age is meant to be? A life of isolation, despite being surrounded by the very people I had devoted myself to." The pain of loneliness was sharp and unrelenting, and the man couldn't escape the weight of his disillusionment. Then, on one sleepless night, when the silence of the room felt almost suffocating, he dreamt of a wise Zen master. In the dream, the master spoke with quiet, yet profound wisdom, saying, "You are clinging to an idea that your children must fulfill your desires. The more you expect from them, the more you will suffer. True peace does not come from others. It comes from within." The words of the Zen master echoed in his mind long after he awoke, and for the first time in a long while, he sat still and reflected deeply. His heart, which had been gripped by resentment, began to soften. He realized that in his desire for love and connection, he had placed unrealistic expectations on his children. He had assumed that their physical proximity would naturally lead to emotional closeness. He had expected them to fulfill the void that his loneliness had created, to be the balm for his aching soul. But was this truly fair? Was it fair to burden them with the weight of his expectations, without considering their struggles and needs? In that quiet moment of realization, the man understood something he had overlooked for so long. Peace, true peace, was not something to be sought in others. It was something to be nurtured from within. The suffering he felt was not caused by his children's indifference, It was born from his attachment to the idea that they owed him something. His heart, once consumed by bitterness, began to shift, and he saw for the first time that perhaps the only person who could truly give him what he longed for was himself. As he pondered this truth, tears welled up in his eyes, not from pain, but from a profound sense of clarity. He knew now that his journey to peace had to begin within, and that he could no longer carry the heavy burden of expectations that had held him captive for so long. 4. The realization of attachment. The elderly man found himself sitting in the quiet solitude of his room, his eyes fixed on the far corner of the room, where the fading light of the evening sun cast long shadows. It had been days, perhaps weeks, since he had truly thought deeply about his life, but now, in this moment of stillness, his mind began to unravel the tangled threads of his suffering. The pain that weighed so heavily on his chest was not simply a result of his children's absence or their apparent disregard for him. No, that was only a small part of it. As he meditated, his thoughts slowly began to clear, and he realized something profound. His suffering was not born out of the lack of love or attention from his children. The true source of his anguish lay in his attachment to them, his expectations that they owed him something. He had allowed himself to believe that their presence in his life, their attention, their affection, would somehow fulfill him, would complete him in a way that nothing else could. But as he sat there, the full weight of this realization came crashing down on him, like a heavy stone dropped into a calm lake, sending ripples through his entire being. In his heart, he had unknowingly placed his happiness in their hands. He had given them a power over him that he should never have granted. For years, he had believed that being near his children, watching them grow, and seeing them become the people they were meant to be, would somehow be the key to his contentment. He had envisioned a life where he could be surrounded by their laughter, their warmth, their love. But as time passed, he found that the more he tried to draw closer to them, the more distant they became. It wasn't that they didn't care for him, not at all. It was that he had expected too much, and in doing so, had placed an impossible burden on them. His heart yearned for something from them that they could not give him, not because they didn't want to, but because he had created an illusion in his mind about what he needed from them. And in that illusion, he had become more isolated than ever before. The deeper he sought connection, the more he found himself surrounded by an emptiness that only grew with time. As he sat in silence, he reflected on the many years of his life. He thought about the teachings of Gautama Buddha, which he had once embraced so fully in his youth before life had begun to weigh him down. The wisdom of detachment had been so clear to him then, so simple to understand. But somewhere along the way, he had let those teachings slip through his fingers like sand. He had convinced himself that attachment to his children, that placing his hopes and dreams into their hands, was natural, even necessary. It was only now, in the quiet of his room, that he saw how misplaced that belief had been. He remembered the Buddha's words, clear as if they had been spoken to him just moments ago. Nothing is yours. You cannot hold on to anything. Everything you have is borrowed. The truth of those words felt like a cold gust of wind against his skin, sharp and unyielding. He realized with sudden clarity that his children, his beloved children, were not his to possess. They were not objects or possessions to be kept close for his comfort. They were their people, with their own lives, and their paths to follow. They had families of their own, responsibilities that had nothing to do with him. By clinging to them, by expecting them to fulfill a need that only he could meet within himself, he was trying to hold on to something that was never his to control. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 2 below to let me know that you are still here with me. The bitterness of that realization stung his heart, but it also awakened something deeper within him, a longing for freedom, for peace. The more he tried to control the situation, the more it slipped through his fingers. He had spent so many years chasing after something that was never meant to be his in the way he thought. His children had their own lives, and no matter how much he wanted to be the center of their world, he could not make them into what he wanted them to be. They were not his to own, his to shape. And yet, for so long, he had believed that if only he was near them, if only they gave him the attention he desired, he would be whole. But now, sitting alone in his room, he understood something far more profound. Happiness, he realized, was never something that could be found in another person, in their presence or their love. It was never something to be grasped or demanded. True happiness, true peace, came from within. The teachings of detachment, which he had once known so well, were not merely concepts to be learned and forgotten. They were a way of life, a way to let go of the things that chained him to suffering. By letting go of his attachment, by accepting that his children had their own lives, he could free himself from the deep, unspoken pain that had plagued him for so long. He could feel the weight of the world lifting off his shoulders as he slowly began to release his grasp on what was never his to control. It wasn't easy. There was still a part of him that longed for the closeness he had imagined, for the dream of a life spent in constant connection with his children. But now, he knew that true freedom would come when he stopped demanding that they be something they could not be. When he stopped clinging, when he allowed them to live their own lives, he could finally begin to live his own. The tears that had once flowed so freely from his eyes, tears of longing and frustration, now felt different. They were not tears of sorrow but of release, of letting go. It was a painful process, but it was also a beautiful one, a journey towards understanding that peace comes not from holding on, but from the courage to let go. As the evening light faded, he sat there quietly, feeling a sense of peace that he had not known in years. It was a peace born of acceptance, of surrendering to the flow of life, and of finally understanding that nothing, not even his children, was ever his to possess. 5. The dangers of dependence. The elderly man had begun to sense an overwhelming and frightening realization, one that crept up on him slowly, like a shadow he had not noticed until it had darkened his entire world. He had, without truly intending to, allowed himself to become dependent on his children. What had started as a simple desire to be close to family, to feel loved and cared for in his later years, had subtly transformed into something far more insidious. The more he found himself longing for their presence, the more he began to rely on them, waiting for them to make time for him, to offer him companionship and comfort. It was as though he had placed his happiness, his emotional well-being, into their hands, expecting them to fill the emptiness inside him. But with each passing day, the consequences of this dependence became more painfully clear. Whenever they failed to meet his expectations, whenever they were too busy with their own lives to check in or spend time with him, a deep feeling of abandonment washed over him, leaving him feeling invisible and unimportant. It was a loneliness that cut through him like a knife, a loneliness he hadn't known existed in his own home. The more he waited for them, the more he realized that, in depending on them for his happiness, he had lost something irreplaceable, his independence. In his search for comfort, he had inadvertently surrendered his strength, his autonomy. This reflection led him back to a story he had once heard from a wise Buddhist monk many years ago, a story that had always resonated with him but now seemed more relevant than ever. In the story, a man was burdened with a heavy sack of grain, traveling from one village to another. The weight of the sack was unbearable, and he complained bitterly about how exhausting the journey had become. Yet when a kind stranger offered to carry the sack for him, the man declined, explaining with conviction, "If I do not carry this burden myself, I will never build the strength to walk on my own." The monk's words had seemed simple, almost trivial at the time, but now they echoed in his mind, clear and sharp. The elderly man suddenly understood the painful truth. Like the man in the story, he had been carrying the heavy burden of old age, but instead of learning to bear it with strength and grace, he had shifted the weight onto his children, hoping they would shoulder the emotional load for him. But in doing so, he realized, he had weakened his spirit. He had allowed himself to become fragile, unable to find peace or contentment on his own. His dependence on his children had robbed him of the resilience he needed to navigate his later years with dignity. And now, he was left to face the emotional consequences, a deep sense of loss, a hollow ache where his independence used to reside. The man's heart ached with the realization that by relying on his children for happiness, he had unwittingly taken away their ability to live their own lives freely, without the weight of his emotional burdens. This revelation, though painful, was also a moment of clarity. It was a call to action, a reminder that true peace and happiness could only come from within, from finding the strength to walk his path, regardless of the circumstances around him. 6. The path to inner peace. It was on a tranquil afternoon, when the world seemed to slow down, that the elderly man sat beneath the comforting shade of a tree, quietly immersed in meditation. As his mind drifted deeper, something profound settled within him, like a long-lost treasure finally uncovered. In that moment of stillness, he understood something he had struggled with for years. Living near his children had never been the issue. The true mistake had been his belief that his happiness depended on them, that their love, attention, and presence were the key to his peace. It was an epiphany that shook him to his core. For the first time, he realized with undeniable clarity that peace doesn't come from the people around us, but from the silence and stillness within our hearts. The words of the Buddha echoed in his mind as if they were meant just for him. Peace comes from within. Do not seek it without. He had spent so many years hoping for his children's visits, for their calls, always attaching his sense of fulfillment to their actions. But in his heart, he now knew the truth. They, despite their deep love for him, could not give him the peace he longed for. True peace could only be cultivated from within. It was about releasing the grip of expectations and surrendering to the present moment, accepting life as it was, without wishing it to be different. A deep sense of warmth filled him as he realized that peace was not a distant goal to be reached, but something that could be nurtured in the present. His children, as much as they cared for him, could not be held accountable for the emotional well-being of his soul. That responsibility lay solely with him. And so, in that stillness, with the soft rustling of the tree leaves around him, he made a conscious decision to change his perspective. No longer would he wait in expectation of phone calls or visits. Instead, he chose to embrace every moment he had, every little blessing that came his way. He began to shift his focus. Rather than measuring his happiness by how often his children reached out, he chose to cherish the moments when they did. But even more than that, he sought joy in the simple, everyday experiences that had always been there, just waiting to be noticed. The sweet melody of birds greeting the dawn, the gentle warmth of the sun as it bathed his skin, the serenity of meditation that brought him back to himself, these were the true gifts of life. It was in these small, seemingly insignificant moments that he found the most profound peace. And for the first time in a long while, he felt complete. In the quiet of that afternoon, he realized that happiness was never something to be found in others. It was something to be nurtured and embraced within. The bond he shared with his children, though invaluable, was not the source of his inner peace. It was merely an expression of the deeper peace that resided within him. And with that understanding, he felt a sense of freedom he had never known before. He was free to live fully, to be grateful for what he had, and to be at peace with what was, rather than what he wished it to be. In the end, peace had never been a destination. It had always been the journey itself. 7. The freedom of letting go. As the elderly man continued on his quiet journey of self-reflection, he came to an epiphany that filled his heart with a profound sense of freedom. Freedom that came from letting go of his attachment to his children. For so many years, he had carried the heavy burden of expectations. Expectations that they would fulfill his dreams, meet his hopes, and live in a way that would make him proud. This weight had brought him nothing but suffering, creating a distance between himself and his loved ones. But now, as he slowly released those expectations, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders, a lightness in his heart that he hadn't known in years. No longer did he feel the constant, gnawing pressure to control their every action, to demand their attention, or to hold them to standards that had nothing to do with who they were as individuals. Instead, he made a quiet but revolutionary decision, to let his children be who they were meant to be. He gave them the space to live their own lives, to make their own choices, free from the chains of his desires and judgments. This wasn't a resignation, not at all. It was a conscious release, a letting go that allowed him to finally focus on his own life. And in this new phase of existence, he found peace. Peace that was not reliant on others, not tied to any external measure of success, but a deep and enduring peace that came from within. As time passed, something beautiful began to unfold. His children, too, began to notice the change in him. The heavy air of expectation, which had once clouded every family gathering, was gone. No longer did they feel obligated to fulfill a role or meet a standard that wasn't their own. Their visits to him were no longer driven by duty but by love, a natural, unforced love that flowed freely, without the weight of obligation. In turn, the elderly man discovered that he no longer sought their company out of loneliness or the desperate need for validation. Instead, he savored their presence with a quiet joy. He enjoyed their laughter, their stories, their very essence, without the need for it to fulfill some deeper longing within him. If you are still watching this video and find these lessons useful, please comment 3 below to let me know that you are still here with me. This freedom, this release of attachment, had transformed him, not just in how he viewed his children, but in how he viewed life itself. He was no longer bound by the fear of losing what he couldn't control. And in this, he had found a richer, fuller connection with his family, one that was rooted in genuine affection rather than dependency. Letting go had not meant losing. It had meant gaining everything he had truly longed for all along, the freedom to love without expectations, and to live a life unburdened by the past. Looking back, he saw with clarity that the chains he had once worn had only held him captive. By setting himself and his children free, he had opened a door to a future filled with peace, authenticity, and an honest, enduring love that was more than he had ever dared to imagine. It was a freedom so beautiful, so complete, that it could only be understood by those brave enough to let go. 8. The lesson of impermanence. As the man continued his journey, he found himself deeply reflecting on one of the fundamental teachings of Buddhism, the profound lesson of impermanence. It was a realization that struck him with both clarity and a deep sense of peace. Everything in life is transient. Our youth, so vibrant and full of energy, slips away as we age. Our health, once robust and unstoppable, can falter in an instant. Even the relationships we hold dear, the bonds we cherish, are subject to the winds of change. Nothing, no matter how precious, is meant to stay the same forever. This truth was not just an abstract concept, but a living reality he could no longer ignore. For so long, he had clung to the past, holding on to memories of his children as little ones, innocent and in need of constant care. But now, in the quiet of his reflection, he saw how life had quietly shifted. His children were no longer the small, dependent beings who had once looked to him for everything. They had grown into adults, each with their own lives, responsibilities, and struggles. It was an incredibly emotional moment for him, realizing that the little hands that once reached out for comfort had long since grown strong and independent. His heart swelled with pride and, yes, a hint of sadness, because he knew that their paths had diverged from his own in ways he could never reverse. And yet, within this bittersweet realization, there was peace. Peace is the acceptance that change is not something to resist, but something to embrace. The man found a deep sense of serenity in understanding that impermanence is not a curse but a gift, a natural part of the ebb and flow of life. His relationship with his children, like all things in life, had shifted, grown more complex, yet deeper in its way. Clinging to the past, wishing for those days of diapers and bedtime stories to return, would only cause him suffering. In that moment, he understood that the key to true peace lay not in holding on to what was, but in embracing what is, and trusting that the changes, though painful at times, are the essence of life's beauty. The lesson of impermanence was not one of despair but of liberation. It freed him from the fear of loss and allowed him to appreciate the preciousness of the present moment, knowing that the future, though uncertain, holds its beautiful possibilities. And that brings us to the end of our reflection on the lesson of impermanence. What are your thoughts? Have you discovered something meaningful in this story that resonates with your own life? Take a moment to think about one thing you've learned and how you can bring it into practice. Perhaps it's the understanding that change is inevitable, or maybe it's finding peace in letting go of the past to embrace the present. We'd love to hear from you. Share in the comments below one lesson you've taken from this and how you plan to apply it to your own life. Let's inspire and learn from each other. If you found this video helpful, please leave a comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more meaningful stories and reflections. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.